All right, Rabosai, good morning. Good morning. Let us begin. Begin by thanking all of our sponsors for this morning shiur. To thank our TALMUD TORAH sponsors for the month of Kislev, Josh and Becca Friedman, for dedicating all of Shiurim and Drushos this month in creation of the yahrzeit of Josh's father, Yisroel Yehuda ben HaRav Chaim Rephael, as well as for an aliyah for the Neshamas of all of those who were murdered on Kiddush Hashem on Simchas Torah and Eretz Yisrael, for a safe return of all of our chayalim and hostages, and for a complete and enduring refuah for all of those who have been injured. Sammy and Malka Esterson in memory of their parents, Hinda bas Henech Ephraim, Yitzchak Leib ben Aaron HaKohen, and Sarah Rachel Bas Baruch Avram. The Pepper family in memory of their brother and uncle Yosef Pepper, Yosef David ben Yaakov Zichron Livracha. And our week of learning sponsors, Doug and Gail Stanger in memory of Doug's father, Shraga Feivel ben Moshe Avram Halevi Zichron Livracha. And of course, we dedicate all of Maseches Bava Kamma to Master Sergeant Eliyahu Harush, who died on Kiddush Hashem while fighting against terrorists in Sderot. We hope that in the merit of our TALMUD TORAH, his Neshama will have an aliyah and his family a Neshama. And of course, we hope in the general merit of our TALMUD TORAH, all of the Neshamas will have an aliyah, all the families in Neshama, and all of those who need a refuah should have one together in Meretz Hashem B'soch Shar Chole Yisrael. With that, let us begin. A lot to do today. Actually, my hope is in Meretz Hashem to even get into tomorrow's blot just a little bit. But let's begin. So we are on the Mishnah on Chaf Daled base 24b, the Mishnah. Shar hamazik b'reshus hanizak ketzad. So I'll say, what is the case of a shar mazik? So remember again, now what's interesting is as follows. We're jumping back a little bit to Karen. So remember again, we've actually spent, this has been a really nice parak so far, where each Mishnah has kind of delved a little bit deeper into some other aspect, some other dimension of one of the forms of damage. But of course, again, one of the most unique forms of damage is Karen. Why is Karen unique? Because Karen, remember again, is the only one that has a chatzi nezek versus a nezek shalim. That's the fundamental distinction. So the Gemara says as follows: Shor hamazik b'reshus hanizak ketzad. What is the case of an ox that damages in the domain or in the property of the damaged party? So again, Ruvain's ox goes into Shimon's property and damages in Shimon's property. Whether it's damaging a person, whether it's damaging property, whether it's damaging produce, that's really irrelevant. So what's the halacha? Ketzad nagach. The animal gores, nagaf, pushed, nashach, bit, ravatz, squatted on, ba'at, kicked, birshus harabim. So if an animal did any of these things in rishus harabim, so the halach is mishalim chatzi nezek. You have to pay chatzi nezek. So both say, so again, that's just the typical case of Karen Tam. First time Karen offender. Now, by the way, the wording of the Mishnah is strange, right? Because the Mishnah itself says, what's the case of shar hamazik birshus hanizak? And then it starts off with the case of nezek b'reshus harabim. Okay, just fine. We're going to get to Rishus Hanizak just in a little bit. So the idea over here is that Allah l'maisa, an animal does. So remember again. Let's go back just to reinforce. What's Karen? Karen is abnormal, aggressive, damaging behavior. That's Karen. So and that's the list over here: goring, pushing, biting, squatting, kicking. So ultimately, again, aggressive, damaging, abnormal behavior. So the Gemara says as follows: if the animal does this in Rosh Hashanah, then Allah l'maisa, again, for a first-time offender, chatzi nezek. What about b'reshus hanizak? What about if the animal does this damage in the domain, ultimately, of the damaged party? So again, Ruvain's ox does damage in Shimon's property. What's the halacha? Rabbi Tarfon Omer nezek shalim. Ooh, interesting. Now we've actually quoted this shita, but we've quoted Rabbi Tarfon before. Rabbi Tarfon holds that Karen Tam b'reshus hanizak pays nezek shalim. One more time. Everyone is agreeing that Karen Tam, first time offender Karen, in Rosh Hashanah pays chatzi nezek. By the way, it's not just first time; it's every time until when? It's a muad. We saw yesterday's daf machlokes again. Is it time number 3 or is it time number 4? Okay, we'll leave that on the side. But l'maisa, for now, everyone is agreeing that Karen Tam pays chatzi nezek in Rosh Hashanah. The machlokes we're going to see, raging machlokes, is going to be whether or not what you pay for Karen Tam b'reshus hanizak. First time or again, Tam Karen Tam damage done in the property of the damaged party. Rabbi Tarfon says full damages. Nezek shalim. Nezek shalim. Fine, that's Rabbi Tarfon. So the Chum say chatzi nezek. Chum say no chatzi nezek. So both say the Chachamim essentially hold that halacha l'maisa there is no distinction. Chum hold that keren tam has one halacha, whether it's keren tam in reshus hanizak or whether it's keren tam ultimately in reshus hamazik. It doesn't. Keren tam in reshus harabim or keren tam in reshus hanizak doesn't make a difference. Keren tam is always going to be chayalim. So the Chachamim are easy to remember because the Chachamim essentially say until you become a muad in keren, you're going to pay chatzi nezek. We don't care where the damage is done. Rabbi Tarfon is what makes this distinction between damage keren done in reshus harabim, which is chatzi nezek, and keren done in reshus hanizak, the property of the damaged party, which will be nezek shalim. So listen to this. I'm going to Rabbi Tarfon. So Rabbi Tarfon says to the Chum, I don't understand your position. It's very exciting. Uma b'makom shahakel ala shein v'ala regel b'shus harabim shu pater. So Rabbi Tarfon wants to make the following kal v'chomer. He says like this. Look at the following scenario. What about in a situation where you're makel on regel and shein? I will say, where are we makel on regel and shein? Where? In Rishus Harabim. We spoke about this last week, right? If an animal does shein or regel damage, again, an animal goes ahead and eats something in Rishus Harabim that doesn't belong to it. An animal goes ahead and tramples upon someone else's utensil in Rishus Harabim. What's the halacha? What's the halacha? Pater. Pater. So Ritarfus is like this. If shein and regal, which are pater in Rishus Harabim, hichmir alein birshus hanizak l'shalim nezek shalim. Ultimately, again, so what's the halacha? Shein and regal birshus hanizak is nezek shalim. So watch this. So shor and regal in Rishus Harabim is pater. Shor and regal in Rishus hanizak is chayiv nezek shalim, complete damages. Therefore, makom shehichmir al karen birshus harabim l'shalim chatzi nezek. So we'll say Keren, which in Rishus Harabim is already at what? Already at what? Already at Chatzi Nezek. So therefore, again, Eino Din, Shenachmir Alav Birshus Hanizek L'Shalim Nezek Shalim. So should go without saying that you should have to pay for complete damages in Rishus Hanizek. Also, you hear the Kal V'chomer? It's actually next to the Kal V'chomer. If Shein and Regel, which are pater in Rishus Harabim, are Chayiv Nezek Shalim in Rishus Hanizak, then all the more so, Keren, which is already chayiv chatzi nezek in Rishus Harabim, should definitely be chayiv nezek shalim in Rishus Hanizak. Pretty solid kal v'chomer. Amrulo, they said to Rabbi Tarfon, no. Dayo lovo min hadin liyos kinidon. So we're going to spend actually a lot of time today on this concept. Let me tell you outside, then we'll look inside of Rashi. We'll say the concept of Dayo says like this. Whenever you make a kal v'chomer, right? So remember again, we'll say, what's a kal v'chomer? Kal v'chomer essentially means that if you find a certain trait within an area of halacha or a concept that is generally treated more leniently, then we assume automatically that concept applies to something that is more stringent. Right? Just logically. If you find the halachic concept that applies to something that is kal, more lenient, it makes sense that same halachic reality should apply to something that is more chomer. Fine. So I'll say, for example over here, so halacha l'maisa, again, if you're going to say that shein, right? So if you're going to say that shein and keren are pater, or essentially what we're saying is like this: if keren, shein and regal, which are more kal, so to speak, are pater in Rishus Harabim, and right, because that's the kal kite. They're more lenient because they're pater in Rishus Harabim. So if shein regal and pater in Rishus Harabim, and yet they're chayiv nezek shalim in shein and regal, chayiv nezek shalim in Rishus Hanizak, right? Chayiv nezek shalim in Rishus Hanizak. So therefore, of course, Keren, which is more chomer in how it's chayiv chatzi nezek in Rishus Harabim, should certainly be more should be chayiv nezek shalim in Rishus Harabim. Okay, that's the logic. The concept of dayo, Rabbosai, means that in a kal v'chomer, sometimes the new extrapolation of halacha is limited. There's a ceiling on it. There's a ceiling based on the source of the chumrah. In other words, the new law could be no more machmir than the original stringency in the base law. So look at Rashi for just a moment. So in other words, what we do is we cap kal v'chomers. So kal v'chomer, the result of the kal v'chomer, could be no more chomer than the chumrah part of the original formula of the kal v'chomer. So take a look at Rashi. Rashi says, Karen b'rishos hanizak, shata mevi midin Karen b'rishos harabim, deka'amrit Karen shechmir aliyah b'rishos harabim, ino din shenachmir aliyah b'rishos. So we'll say, let's apply this over here. Essentially what we want to say is like this. If shein and regal, which are pater in rishos harabim, are chayiv nezek shaleim in rishos hanizak, that we know is a fact. Therefore, Karen, which is chayiv chatzi nezek in rishos harabim, should be certainly chayiv nezek shaleim in rishos hanizak. That's Rabbi Tarfon's logic. Chachamim say that kal v'chomer doesn't work. Why? Because the most you could do, what Dayo says is, the result of the kal v'chomer could be no more chomer than the chumrah you're using in the formulation of the kal v'chomer. So remember, what's the chumrah? This is interesting. What's the chumrah we're using in the formulation of the kal v'chomer? What's the chumrah? Karen. Karen where? Rishos harabim. Karen Rishos harabim is chayiv what? Chatzi nezek, which means that the result of the kal v'chomer could generate obligation for Karen, but no more than what? No more than chatzi nezek. You hear this logic? In other words, when you're making a kal v'chomer, the chumrah that you're using in the formulation of the kal v'chomer, the resulting chumrah could be no more powerful. What a kal v'chomer allows you to do is essentially take a concept that applies in one place and apply it somewhere else. But the severity or the intensity of the applied concept can't be any stronger than the derivative concept, than where you're deriving it from. So since it's so fascinating, and we'll say, by the way, we'll talk about where this concept of dayo comes from. So Rabbi Tarfon kind of is like a little bit of a runaway train with Karen. You know what happens? We get excited about Karen and you just keep going, right? So we'll say, so what happens? Rabbi Tarfon says, again, his kal v'chomer is, if Karen is going to be chayiv chatzi nezek in rishos harabim, then certainly it's going to be chayiv essentially nezek shaleim, ultimately in rishos hanezek. To which the Chum say, calm down. That's not true. I hear your kal v'chomer, but really, based on your kal v'chomer, the most you could do is say that if Karen is chayiv chatzi nezek in rishos harabim, it's certainly going to be chayiv what? Chatzi nezek in rishos hanizak, but no more than that. That's the machlokes. Okay, I thought we were really going to get further than this. Okay, let's good. Okay, sorry. Amrlo, so good. Let's go back there. Amrlo, Dayolov min adin lios kinidon. Ma b'rishos harabim chatzi nezek, af b'rishos hanizak chatzi nezek. So we'll say that's their logic. So the Chum say that Rabbi Tarfon, it's great kal v'chomer, but Dayo says again, the results from the kal v'chomer could be no more chomer than the source of the actual chumrah. So therefore, again, just like the source is chatzi nezek, therefore the application of the kal v'chomer cannot result in anything more than chatzi nezek as well. So Rabbi Tarfon says back to them, top of Chav Hey, 25a. Af ani lo adun Karen mi Karen. You're right. I'm not. See, Rabbi Tarfon says to them, you're making a mistake. You think I'm learning Karen from Karen. I'm not learning Karen b'rishos hanizak from Karen b'rishos harabim. That's not how I'm learning. Rather, again, ani adun Karen me regal. I'm actually learning out Karen from regal. Uma b'makom shahakal ala shein b'haregal b'rishos harabim. So we'll say, if in a situation where Chazal were makel on Karen and shein rishos harabim, because Karen and shein rishos harabim are pater, so hichmir b'Karen, you're machmir by Karen to say that it's chayiv chatzi nezek. Makom shehichmir ala shein v'ala regal b'rishos hanizak. Eino din shenachmir b'Karen. So ultimately, again, in a situation where they are machmir on shein and regal in rishos hanizak, that you're chayiv nezek shalim, certainly you should be machmir on Karen. So Rabbi say, so the exchanges are very interesting, which we'll have to discuss, because Rabbi Tarfon is essentially stating the same kal v'chomer. What he's trying to say is, I'm not learning it out from Karen. So because I'm not learning it out from Karen, therefore I shouldn't be capped by Dayo. I'm learning it out ultimately again from Shein and Regal. But they say back to him, it's fascinating, Rabbanan say back to him, Amrlo, Dayo lava min adin lios kinidon. Rabbi Tarfon, yes you are learning it out from Karen. I understand what you're trying to do, but at the end of the day, you are learning out Karen from Karen. You're trying to say, essentially, I would say, kind of if you boil down the kal v'chomer, is that if Karen is already going to be chayiv, chatzi nezek in rishos harabim, it certainly should be chayiv what? Nezek shalem in rishos hanizak. That is what, I understand you're trying to say you're learning out from Shein and Regal, but Lamaisa, you're trying to learn out from Karen. and therefore they once again throw back at him, Dayo lava min adin lios knido. Ma b'rishus harabim chatzi nezek, just like ultimately again, rishus harabim, you're chayiv chatzi nezek, ach b'rishus hanizak chatzi nezek. So to rishus hanizak, you're going to be chayiv chatzi nezek as well. Shavuot says so incredible. So therefore, again, halacha l'maisa, what comes out of here is a fundamental machlokes between Rabbi Tarfon and the Rabbanon. And Rabbi say, here's the good news. What does everybody agree with? Everyone agrees that keren b'rishus harabim is chatzi nezek until the animal becomes a muad, right? So that everyone agrees with. The only machlokes is keren b'rishus hanizak. The Rabbanon say chatzi nezek because the Rabbanon say there's one halacha for keren tam. Halacha for keren tam doesn't matter whether the keren damage was done. One halacha. Rabbi Tarfon says not true. Ultimately, again, keren tam b'rishus hanizak is going to carry penalty, or not penalty, but damages of nezek shalim. Nezek shalim learns that from a Kal V'chomer. The Rabbanim disagree with Kal V'chomer because of the concept of dayo. Good. So we'll say, so now let's talk a little bit about dayo. Says the Gemara, Rabbi Tarfon, let's lay dayo. Does Rabbi Tarfon not hold to the concept of dayo? In other words, we'll say, after all, v'had dayo da'oraisahu. So I'll say this is fascinating. I think in all of our journeys through Shas, we've spoken about dayo. I'm not sure we've actually ever had this Gemara. Actually quotes it over here, Basra and Zvachim. Okay, no, we haven't had it so far, which is really interesting. So also we've had this concept of dayo, that there's a ceiling on a Kal V'chomer, right? But where does that concept come from? And remember, I will say, so remember, a Kal V'chomer is one of the Yud Gimel, right? One of the 13 exegetical principles, right? The Yud Gimel Midos Shatar Nedrash Esplain. Now, understand when and how to use a Kal V'chomer is often either a halacha l'Moshe Sinai or some type of Masorah, but generally again is a daraisa. So now the Gemara is saying, Rabbi Tarfon, how can you possibly go ahead and reject dayo? After all, again, dayo is daraisa. Now this is fascinating. Where do you find dayo as a daraisa? This is so interesting. Disanya, here we go. Disanya, we didn't Kal V'chomer Ketzad. So we'll say, where do we see the concept of a Kal V'chomer in the Torah? This is amazing. Vayomer Hashem Moshe, va'avia yarok yirak b'fanel, halo sikalim shivas yamim. So I will say, so now remember a bit of context. This is Chumash Bamidbar, where Miriam spoke Lashon Hara about Moshe Rabbeinu. Right? So Miriam spoke alidos isha kushis lakach. Right? Ultimately, Miriam spoke negatively about Moshe Rabbeinu. This was after the episode of Eldad Umeidad. Right? People are prophesizing. Miriam doesn't understand why Moshe doesn't live with his wife, why Moshe doesn't live with his family. And of course, it's Miriam really not understanding the greatness of her brother. In any event, she speaks negatively about Moshe to Aaron. At this point in time, she is stricken with tsaras. Moshe Rabbeinu intervenes on her behalf and says, remember again, the shortest but yet one of the most impactful tefillos in the entire Torah, Kel na rifana la. Please, HaKadosh Baruch Hu, heal her. So this is the Ribono Shel Olam's response to Moshe Rabbeinu. Vayomer Hashem Moshe, so Hashem said to Moshe, Va'avia yarok yirak b'fanei lo sikam shelos yamim. If her father had spit in her face, would she not be embarrassed for 7 days? In other words, what HaKadosh Baruch Hu was trying to tell Moshe Rabbeinu was that there has to be some type of repercussion, right? There has to be every action carries a reaction. Miriam did something wrong. Had she gone ahead and just simply offended a human being, would there not be a repercussion? So achas Kamma v'Kamma, where again the Ribono Shel Olam took the Lashon Hara against Moshe Rabbeinu as an affront to himself. So essentially Hashem says to Moshe, had she offended her father, right? Ultimately, again, would the punishment have not been at least 7 days? Now watch this. Kal v'chomer l'shchina arba asar yom. Interesting. So the Gemara understands this is, if the affront to a human being would have resulted in 7 days, so to speak, of banishment, so the Kal v'chomer is, if it's 7 days for offending another human being, then what? It should be 14 days for offending the Shechina. But Dayo lava minadin lios knidon. Incredible. But Dayo says, now remember, Miriam was outside of the Machane for 7 days. Now again, remember, the camp waited for her. No one traveled without Miriam. But Lamais, again, so here the Gemara says, you see a Kal v'chomer, right? Kal v'chomer is HaKadosh Baruch Hu says, if she would have offended her father, 7 days repercussion, and therefore for the Shechina it should be at least double that. But Dayo lava minadin lios knidon, we cap it. So both say, so here you see the concept of Kal v'chomer, and here you see the concept of Dayo. Incredible. Absolutely incredible. So both say, so the point over here is, Dayo is a biblical concept. If it's a biblical concept, it seems like Rabbi Tarfon doesn't subscribe to it. So the shaila is, how could Rabbi Tarfon not subscribe to a biblical concept? To which the Gemara says, Ki lesle dayo heicha de mifrach kal v'chomer. So I will say, ultimately, again, when does Rabbi Tarfon reject the use of dayo? That's when dayo ultimately, again, will create a pircha on the kal v'chomer. Heicha de lo mifrach kal v'chomer is le dayo. But ultimately, again, when it won't pose a problem to the kal v'chomer, then halacha l'maisa, again, he holds of dayo. Take a look at Rashi just a moment. Heicha de mifrach, umas nisin idrash de dayo mifrach kal v'chomer kulei, v'lo gamras b'midi kidim afarashin and the hasam shel. So listen to this. So l'maisa, this is actually very interesting. So Rabbi Tarfon holds of dayo. When does he hold of dayo? When dayo doesn't undermine the totality of the kal v'chomer. But if dayo undermines the totality of the kal v'chomer, then it doesn't make sense to apply dayo. So I say, go back to our Mishnah. If you apply dayo, then what? There's no kal v'chomer. Essentially, there's no kal v'chomer. Right? Because the Maseches will say, remember, think about it for just a moment. What you're saying, remember, what was the kal v'chomer? If shein and regal, which are pater in Rishus Harabim, are chayiv nezek shaleim, ultimately again in Rishus Hanizak, then Keren, which is chayiv chatzi nezek in Rishus Harabim, should certainly be chayiv nezek shaleim in Rishus Hanizak. So Dayo says no, it's only chayiv chatzi nezek in Rishus Hanizak. So then you haven't really made a kal v'chomer. In other words, then what's the kal and chomer? In other words, I will say in general, what we're trying to show is that regal is more kal, yet results in nezek shaleim in Rishus Hanizak. So Karen's more chamer, but it's not more chamer because it's going to be it's the same. Actually, it's not even the same. It's actually less because now Karen, which was supposedly more chamer, is only chayiv chatzi nezek. So Rabbi Tarfon says then dayo undermines the kal v'chomer. So if dayo is going to undermine the kal v'chomer, we dispense with dayo and we go with the kal v'chomer. So it's interesting. I will say. So what you see over here is Rabbi Tarfon accepts dayo. But apparently Rabbi Tarfon's Mesorah in dayo is that you only apply it when it doesn't undermine the very kal v'chomer you're trying to make. But if dayo undermines the kal v'chomer, then dispense with it. Fascinating. So the Gemara says, Hasam Shiva Deshchina Lo Ksivi. So as I said, now remember again, let's go back for just a second. So that was Rashi. So now the Gemara says, Hasam Shiva Deshchina Lo Ksivi. Now remember again, I both say, this idea that the Gemara was trying to convey, that Cheshbon was trying to convey, that if, the 7 days of the Shekhinah are not written in the Torah. Asa kal v'chomer, asa arbesar. So remember again. So now Cheshbon says to Moshe, if her father she would have offended her father, she was right. Then ultimately, again, she would be banished for 7 days. So the Gemara doesn't talk anything about 7 days of the Shekhinah. So kal v'chomer comes along and says, I see arbasar. So then again, ultimately, if she would have offended her father, Torah says it would have been 7 days. Kal v'chomer says for the Shekhinah it should be 14 days. Asa dayo apik shiva va'oki shiva. So therefore again, dayo says, no. Dayo says, let's leave it at 7. Although the kal v'chomer would have said it should have been 14, dayo comes along and removes the additional 7 and restores it back to the original 7. So essentially, we'll treat mistreatment of the Shekhinah just like mistreatment by a father. Or of a father, I should say. Avahocha chatzi nezek siv. But over here, we'll say by Karen, it says chatzi nezek. Vasa kal v'chomer v'aisi chatzi nezek achrina v'nasa nezek shali. Now, in Rabbi Tarfon's model, you say like this. Torah already tells us that a Karen tam pays chatzi nezek. Okay, chatzi nezek. The whole point of the kal v'chomer is what? To add on an additional chatzi nezek. And to say that Karen b'rshus hanizak should be chayiv nezek shalim. I darashta dayo. But if you hold of dayo, then afrech le kal v'chomer. If you hold of dayo, that means dayo is going to cap Karen b'rshus hanizak at the same level of Karen b'rshus hamazik, b'rshus harabim, and therefore again, dayo undermines the kal v'chomer. Therefore again, if dayo undermines the kal v'chomer, Rabbi Tarfon says dispense with dayo. Fascinating. For Rabbanon, shiva deshchina ksivi. According to the Rabbanon, the 7 days regarding one who mistreats the Shekhinah are written, because the pasuk says, Tisager shivas yamim. Rabbi Tarfon will say, Hahu tisager, that lashon of tisager, right, being literally against the question for 7 days. So the Gemara says, Hahu tisager, didarshinon, dayohu. So again, Rabbi Tarfon would say that's actually the source of the dayo. But Rabbanon, ksiv krach rino. Ultimately, there's another pasuk, Vatisager Miriam. Rabbi Tarfon, Hy'd afilu ba'ama darshinan dayo. We'll say that extra phrase teaches us that even outside of this case, we would still darshan dayo. Why? V'lo tomar hacha mishum kavodo shamosha v'al ba'amalo. That we'll say is interesting. So let's just take a step back over here. The source for, first of all, for Kal V'chomer and dayo is this episode with Moshe Rabbeinu. Right? So remember again, Moshe Rabbeinu wants Miriam healed right now, and he wants her back in the camp right now. Kadosh Baruch Hu says, listen, had she had a falling out with a father, there would have been a repercussion for at least 7 days of banishment. So again, then the Kal V'chomer says for the Shechina at least 14. Dayo says, no, keep it at 7. Keep it at 7. So we'll say it's interesting. So because this is the source, you might have thought maybe dayo only applies in this case out of kavod to Moshe Rabbeinu. Right? Out of kavod to Moshe Rabbeinu. After all, so essentially, Kadosh Baruch Hu was kind of meeting Moshe Rabbeinu halfway. Right? Moshe Rabbeinu wanted Miriam to be healed immediately. The Shechina said really she should have been banished for 14 days. Dayo says, let's meet in the middle and we'll keep it at 7. I might have thought that maybe dayo only applies out to the kavod of Moshe Rabbeinu. Kamash on the extra face teaches us that no, dayo is a general exegetical principle that can be applied to all cases of Kal V'chomer. Incredible. Good. So we'll say, let's just pause here for just a second. So here's what we've got. It turns out that this machlokes regarding Keren in Chatzar HaNizak, Keren in the domain of the damaged party, where the Rabbanan are holding Chatzi Nezek and Rabbi Tarfon is holding Nezek Shaleim. Interestingly enough, is all about, in other words, the Rabbanan we're going to see just hold one halacha for Keren Tam. But even if the Rabbanan want to agree with the Kal V'chomer of Rabbi Tarfon, because Rabbi Tarfon's Kal V'chomer could be, you could agree with Kal V'chomer, so what would be the machlokes? The machlokes is the application of the concept of dayo. Rabbi Tarfon telling me that dayo doesn't apply in this case. Why? So it's interesting. Rabbi Tarfon has selective application of dayo. Not his own personal, but he has a principle. He has a Masorah. Dayo applies only when it doesn't undermine the Kal V'chomer. But if dayo undermines the Kal V'chomer, like it would do in this case, you don't apply dayo. So fascinating. I will say, isn't it also incredible that we just picked up such a huge piece of information? First of all, I will say, almost like the Torah's makar for Kal V'chomer, Torah's makar for Kal V'chomer is the Ribono Shel Olam's conversation with Moshe Rabbeinu, which is fascinating. And the Torah's makar for dayo is this same episode. It's incredible. Absolutely incredible. All right, let's go back there. Amir Papa Abaye. So Papa said to Abaye, Vaha Hy'd Dalo Darish Dayo, V'Afagav Dal Machve Kal V'chomer. So I'll say, so now where we're kind of holding is like this. Everyone holds a dayo. Just Rabbi Tarfon says when dayo undermines the Kal V'chomer, you don't apply it. They both say now what the Gemara is going to show. Rav Papa says to Abaye, there is an example of someone who doesn't apply dayo, even though dayo doesn't undermine the Kal V'chomer. Which sounds like what Rabbi said, that maybe the entire concept of dayo is subject to machlokes. So here we go. Here's the case. This anya, keri bizav minayin. So it's actually an interesting case. What happens if a guy is a zav? And then he has a seminal emission. A lot going on. Right? So what's the halacha? What's his status? Or specifically, what's the status of the keri? What's the status of seminal emission? So the Gemara says as follows: Minayin v'dinhu. So we'll say now. Watch this. So let's clarify. Let's clarify what we're asking over here. Take a look at Rashi. Rashi says keri b'zav minayin. Keri shel zav minayin shetei atipa mitame b'mago ub'masa ketipa shel zov. Now we'll say now. This is actually interesting. The halacha is like this. In general, a zav emission has the ability to convey tumah by maga through touching it, contact, or masa, carrying it. Now remember again, carrying means what? Even if you're not touching it. So for example, let's say there's a zav emission on top of a cushion, and I'm carrying the cushion, I'm not coming in direct contact with the emission, I am still tamei. That's different than carry. A seminal emission could convey tumah through contact, maga, but not through masa. But what happens if a zav has a seminal emission? So how do I know now that emission of a zav, that carry emission, has the same status as a zav emission, and for a zav, carry, seminal emission, would be matami through maga and masa. How do I know that? Watch this, fascinating. V'dinu, simple Kal V'chomer. Matar, bitar, tame, bitame. So we'll say, so just like that which is tar when it comes to tar, in other words, we'll say, what does that mean? Something that is tar by a person who's tar. What's an example of that? Saliva. the saliva of a tar person. I will say, Ruvain is a tar guy. Ruvain spits. That's saliva. It's tar. Right? It's tar. Yet, tamei b'tamei. Yet if Ruvain is tamei, his saliva becomes tamei as well. So, okay, right? Tar b'tar. That which is normally tar in a person who is tar, when that same person becomes tamei, that ID becomes tamei as well. So when Ruvain is tar, his saliva is tar. Now Ruvain becomes tamei, his saliva is tamei. So tamei b'tar eno din shei tamei b'tamei. So it goes without saying there's something that is tamei by a person that is tar. What's an example of saying that is tamei by a person that's tar? Carry. Seminal emission. Right? A seminal emission is something that is tamei by a person who is tar. Right? A tar man has a seminal emission. That emission is tamei. So eino din shei tamei b'tamei. So certainly what? Certainly then a seminal emission of a zav should also be tamei. Should also be tamei. So let's say now watch this. Now remember what say. If you are wearing your dio hat, what would you say? What would you say? That yes, the seminal emission of a zav should be tamei. But what kind of tumah? No stronger than normal seminal emission, which is maga and not masa. Yet, what does the Gemara say? V'kamaisila bein b'maga bein b'masa. And yet, we say that the halacha is that the carry of a zav is tamei both b'maga and masa, both touching, both through contact and through carrying. V'amai nema hani kavachomer l'maga. Say that the kavachomer should say that the carry of a zav ultimately again should be tamei b'maga, and then the hani dayo la fuke masa. But dayo should say one second. Cap the tumah of carry for a zav at the same level of tumah of carry for a regular guy. Just like for a regular person, it's tumas maga, not tumas masa. So to the carry of a zav should also only be tumas maga and not masa, only contact and not carrying. And yet we don't do that. So what do you see from here? You see from here that even in cases where dayo doesn't destroy the kal v'chomer, we still don't apply dayo. Well, maybe you'll say again, for maga, it's obvious. In other words, I don't need a limo to tell me that the carry of a zav conveys tumah through contact. That's obvious. As I will say again, the carry of a zav is no different. There's no worse, so to speak, than the carry of a guy who is tar. And just like the carry of a guy who is tar conveys tumah through maga, through contact, so too the carry of a zav is certainly going to convey tumah through maga as well. So Gemara says that's not true. I'll tell you why you need it. Mikra Laila. We'll say when the Torah speaks on a seminal emission, it calls it a Mikra Laila, right? An event, an occurrence that happened that night. Misha Karya Gorim Lo. So we'll say, in other words, it's talking about someone who became Tameh as a result of a seminal emission. Yatza Zeh She'in Karya Gorim Lo Ela Davar Achar. But maybe the halacha is, Rabbi say, that maybe the halachos of a Baal Keri only applied to someone who became Tameh because of the seminal emission. But maybe someone who's already tamei because of a pre-existing condition, i.e., he was a zav. Maybe his carry doesn't have the same level of tumah. Kamash malon, no. Kamash malon not. The Gemara says, really? Kamash malon no. That even a zav becomes tamei through his carry. Gemara says, 1 second. Midi v'lo davar achar ksiv. So we'll say that's obvious. In other words, does the pasuk say that you could only become tumas carry through bal carry, not if you have a pre-existing tumah? So the Gemara says, Uman tana d'shamas leidamar shichva zara shalzam matayim masa. So the Gemara says, who is the opinion that says that the shichva zara, that similar emission of a zav becomes tamei through masa, through carrying? Lo Rabbi Eliezer, lo Rabbi Yeshua. This nan shichva zera shel zav, similar mission of a zav mitame b'magav and mitame master Rabbi Eliezer. So this is interesting machlokas. Right. So now we see that what. So Rabbi Eliezer says that the shichva zera of a zav only becomes tamei through maga, contact, and not through carrying. Rabbi Yeshua omer af mitame b'masa. It can even become tamei through masa. Why? Oh, now this is interesting. Shabbos, now watch this. Rabbi Yeshua says the Shich Hazir, the similar emission of a Zav, is tamei both b'maga and b'masa. Why? Because for a Zav, it is impossible to think that he is a similar emission without some droplets of zivus getting mixed in there. So pause here for just a second. Just again, to highlight what's going on over here. So first of all, two things you have to remember. The emission of a zav, we'll say, we didn't get into this, but remember, a zav emission is different than a seminal emission. The emissions themselves are different, both in terms of color as well as consistency. There are also differences in terms of halacha. A Baal carries the seminal emission, conveys tumah only through maga contact, not through masa, not through carrying. Zav emission is tameh both through maga and through masa. Through maga and through masa. Now I will say, okay, so that's the zav halacha. Now remember again, what are we doing now? We just got finished saying before that halacha l'maisa, Rabbi Tarfon holds of dayo, but doesn't hold of it when dayo will destroy the kal v'chomer, as dayo would do in our Mishnah. Good. The Gemara now is telling us that, by the way, there are people who don't apply dayo, even when dayo won't destroy the kal v'chomer. In other words, there are people who seem to just not apply dayo. That's the case we're bringing down over here about a zav who has a seminal emission. So we're trying to figure out over here is, does the seminal emission of the zav take on almost like a zav-like identity, and therefore even the seminal emission will be metame not just through maga, but through masa as well. Now, Abu said the Gemara records this machlokes. So you have Rabbi Eliezer saying that the seminal emission of a zav is only metame b'maga, not masa. Then what happens? Then Rabbi Yoshua says it's even metame b'masa, even through carrying. Why? Because we assume that the seminal emission has some droplets of zivos mixed in. Oh, the Gemara's 1 second. Last line. Halav hachi lo. So we'll say, what do you see? Even Rabbi Yoshua says that the only reason we're going to say the seminal emission of a zav is metame b'maga and b'masa is because there may be some zivus mixed into it. In other words, we'll say, technically speaking, if our zav were to produce a pure specimen, right, of just shichvas zera, just semen, without, and we knew there was nothing else mixed in, it seems to be everyone would agree that it's only metame b'maga and not b'masa. The Gemara says, Ella haytanuhu. So I will say, so the point over here is we kind of knock this off a little bit. We wanted to show this as an example, ultimately again, of where the Tana is not applying dayo. It's not true. This is a different consideration. The reason ultimately, again, why we would be machmir in a case of a zav who has a seminal emission is because we're concerned that within that seminal emission, there's some zivos mixed in. Fine. So that's that case. And the Gemara says, Ella haytanahu. This nan lamala mehen. So also listen to this. It's actually interesting. Before you turn the page, look at the last Rashi. Lamala mehen Rashi says, Mishlosha avos hatumos t'sheretz v'shechva zera v'taimes l'tani ve'el mahach masisim v'sechas kelim v'edim v'tam belom ela b'maga. So we'll say, see, interestingly enough, there are three higher levels of tumah. What are the three higher levels of tumah? On the base, zovo shel zav, right? Literally, again, the emission of a zav. The roko, his saliva. The shichvas zaro, his seminal emission. Umeime raglov, and his urine. The dam hanida, dam of anida. What's talach? In all these cases, on the base, second line, mitamin bein b'maga bein b'masa. Ultimately, again, they are mitame both with maga and with masa. So both say, see, here you see it. Here, the Brisa says explicitly, shichvas zaro shel zav, right? That here you see that the shichvas zara of a zav is going to be metame being b'maga b'masa. Now, both say, now understand what's happening over there. What that essentially represents, Rabbi say, is a kal v'chomer without dayo. Kal v'chomer without dayo. Because remember, again, what we're doing over here is we're treating shichvas zera of a zav like a zav emission, more chomer than a seminal emission. So the Gemara says like this: maybe over here the Tana also holds that the reason why the seminal emission of a zav is going to be tamei bein b'maga bein b'masa is why? Because it's impossible to have a zav emission without droplets of zivos mixed in. To which the Gemara says, Imkain listniye gabi zovo. If that's the case, then included earlier in the list by zovo shel zav. Why do you put roko? The Gemara says gabi roko. So the Gemara says my shna diktani gabi roko. Why do you put it by saliva instead of by zivos? El mishum da asimiroko. Rather, I will say because they're grouping shichva zera together with saliva. They're just like by saliva of a regular person, we'll say again doesn't convey tumah. So too again, shichva zera of a regular person only conveys a more limited tumah, but by shichva zera, ultimately again of a zav, will convey a heightened level of tumah. So we'll say the point over here is you see the creation of a kal v'chomer without the concept of dayo, even though with the application of dayo you wouldn't undermine the kal v'chomer. So we're just introducing that there is a school of thought that just seems not to apply dayo at all. Amali Ravacha midifti Ravina. Vaha hai tana lo darish dayo. V'yafagav lo machmir kal v'chomer. And we'll say, so Ravacha midifti said to Ravina, this tana does not apply dayo, even though dayo will not undermine the kal v'chomer. The sign, you say, give another example of this. Mafitz b'meis minayin. So what's the interesting case? How do you know that halacha l'maisa, a mace, right, a corpse, could convey tumah to a reed mat? Look at Rashi just a moment. Mafitz b'meis minayin. Shemitami l'fish nemar b'meis gabe midyon v'chol beged v'chol kliar. So we'll say it's interesting. The Torah, after the war of Midyan, conveys the fact that tumas mace, or a mace conveys tumah to certain things, to certain materials. So, for example, a mat of reeds is not included in that list. So how do you know that a corpse conveys tumah to a mat of reeds, whether the corpse is on top of it or under the same roof as it? So the Gemara says, "V'dinhu." It's a kal v'chomer. What's the kal v'chomer? Uma pachem kitanim shetahorim bizav metame b'meis. Shabbos say small utensils, small earthenware utensils, which are tahar. They remain tahar through contact with a zav. So we're talking about over here, we're talking about earthenware utensils, which only become tameh because of, through their interior, right? Through contact with their interior. And earthenware utensils have a very small opening. So let's say, again, there's no way to have contact with the interior. So therefore, a zav could not convey tumah to them. And yet, they become tamei tumas mace. If they're under the same roof with a mace, let's say, or comes in contact with the corpse, halacha l'maisa, they become tamei. Mapos shemetame b'zav eno din shitma b'mace. So certainly a mat which can become tamei through contact with the zav certainly should contract tumas mace. The kamai sila, and ultimately, and we apply this bein tumas erev, bein tumas shiva. And Abba say ultimately again we apply this kal v'chomer. Ultimately, whether it results in tumah as well as that 7-day tumah or just 1-day tumah. So the Gemara says, "Va'amai." But why is that? Ema ahani kal v'chomer l'tumas erev va'hani dayo lafukim l'tumas shiva. But why? But say the kal v'chomer should only allow the mat to contract a more limited tumah, what we call tumas erev, and dayo should cap the kal v'chomer and say that it can't contract 7-day tumah. Amalei kvar Rama nihile Rav Nachman bar Zechariah la Abaye. This question was already posed to Rav Nachman bar Zechariah to Abaye. V'amalei Abaye, and Abaye said, Tana mimafetz b'sheretz ma'asila. So ultimately, again, the Tana learned it out from Mapos in the case of a mat that comes in contact with a sheretz. This is what it means to say. Mapos b'sheretz minayin. So I want to say, how do you know that if halacha l'maisa said this same reed mat comes in contact with a sheretz? Ultimately, again, it becomes tamei. Rashi says, actually, let's go like that. How do you know that ultimately, again, a mapos is able to contract tumah through contact with the sharetz? V'dinu, it's kal v'chomer. Uma pachim kitanim shetorim bizav. So we'll say small utensils, which ultimately, again, remain tahar when they have contact with the zar. We'll say, let me just show you this again. Rashi says over here, if you look at Rashi, it's in the third short line. Pachim kitanim torim bizav bechol tumosav the klicheres in metame ela ma'avirav. In general, an earthenware utensil only contracts tumah through contact with the interior of the utensil. Umitoch shepiv shalot tsar. Since we're talking about earthenware utensils that have a very narrow opening, ein yochol lahachnis etzba'ol l'sochol. You can't fit your finger inside of the opening. Ulemedris nami lo chazi, ubeheset nami lo chazi. So therefore, we're talking about earthenware utensils which cannot become tamei through contact with a zav. Okay, back to the Gemara. Uma pachim ketanim shetorim bizav mitamin b'sheretz. Yet these same small earthenware utensils could contract tumah ultimately again through contact with the sheretz. Therefore, mapos shemetame bizav enodin sheitam b'sheretz. Therefore, the mat which can become tamei through contact with the zav certainly again should become tamei through a sheretz. Elamapitz b'neis minai. So, also, how do I know that same reed mat could become tamei ultimately through contact with the corpse? Ne'amar beged v'ar b'sheretz. Israel will say it says beged and ar, right? It says ultimately again beged, which is not just clothing but material, right? Material and ar and leather by sheretz. V'ne'amar beged v'ar b'meis. And both sides says beged and ar, talking about the type of utensils that have the ability to become tamei by a mace. Ma beged v'ar ha'amar b'sheretz. Ma pitz tamei. Just like ultimately, again, I will say beged and ar that it says. I'm sorry. Ma beged v'ar b'sheretz. Ma pitz tamei. So both say just like it says beged and ar by sheretz and ma pitz is tamei by sheretz. So ultimately, af beged v'ar amar b'meis, mapetz tamei. So to again beged or that it says by meis, mapetz is also. So both say essentially like a gzera shava, right? Same verbiage by sheretz, same verbiage by meis. Just like by sheretz, the mapetz, the mat is going to be tamei. So too through contact with the meis is going to become tamei as well. So the Gemara says, interesting, mufna. It must be that this lashon of beggar, now we're going to throw in a whole bunch of other concepts now. We'll say in general, whenever you make a gzera shava, what does a gzera shava require? Gzera shava means you find the same words or the same phrase in two different contexts. In order to use them, I will say, what has to happen? Those words have to quote unquote be mufna. Mufna means free. They're not used for any other drasha. So the Gemara says it must be that beged and are mufna. Beged and are ultimately again are not used for anything else. That's why they're available for the drasha. The ilo mufna, because if they're not mufna, ikal mifrach, you could ask a pircha malasheret shekin metame ba'adasha. So say, comparing sherets to mace is not so pashat. Why? Because sherets, I will say, on the other hand, only conveys tumah, or I'm sorry, not only. Sherets can even convey tumah in a very small size, even if it's the size of a lentil. Tomar b'meis she'emetayim b'chadasha. Corpse doesn't convey tumah in such a small shear. Ella b'kizayis. To which the Gemara says, you're right. Loi, that is incorrect. That is correct. Afnuye mufna. The phrase beged va'ar is open. It's not used for any other drasha. Therefore, it can be used to establish the gzera shava. So Michti, let's analyze this. Sheretz is kishel shechva zera. Sheretz is compared to shechva zera. Household dichsiv o ish asher tetzei v'samichlei o ish asher yiga b'chol sheretz. So most of it is a juxtaposition. Ultimately again between sheretz and ultimately again shechva zera. Psukim are juxtaposed. So the Gemara says uksiv bei b'shechva zera, and it says by shechva zera v'chol baged v'chol ar asher yelav shechva zera. So we'll say, so by shechva zera. Also loshon of beged and or, right? That if shechva zera is on a beged, it could convey tumah to that. Beged v'or the kasev rachmana b'sheretz namali. So why do I need that extra beged v'or by sheretz? In other words, the juxtaposition of sheretz to shechva zera could have said, just like shechva zera has an impact on beged v'or, so to sheretz has an impact on beged v'or. Why do you need beged v'or to also be written by sheretz? Shma mino la'afnuye. Ultimately, again, to leave it open, that extra phrase is open, ultimately, again, for the use for Gzera Shava. Ba'akati mufnu mitzad echadu. But I will say, but in general, it's only open on one side. So the Gemara says, mufnu mitzad echadu, hanichel mandar mufnu mitzad echad meidin. So I will say, so here's the interesting shayla in general. When making a Gzera Shava, do you need the phrase to be open on one side or both sides? In other words, if you only need it for one side, then fine, the Gzera Shava is fine. The Gemara says, so Shaper, but according to the opinion that says that if it's only mufna on one side that you could go ahead and make the limud, but it's subject to contradiction. The mace name afduye mufna. Suppose say halacha l'maisa, you have to say that halacha l'maisa is opened by mace as well. In other words, so therefore the lashon of beged and va'ar is going to be open both on the side of sheretz as well as on the side of mace as well. Incredible. So Mar says michti mace is kish l'shechva zera. So mace is compared to shechva zera. D'chsev v'anogeh b'chol tamei nefesh o ish asher teitzi mimenu uksibe b'shechva zera. And it says by shechva zera. It says by v'chol beged v'chol ar asher yilo shechva zera. Beged va'ar the kasev rachmana b'meis lamali. So both say, so once again the Gemara says like this: if halacha l'maisa, a mace is compared to shechva zera. So therefore I both say, if the pasuk already says beged va'ar by shechva zera, right? Then why do I need beged va'ar by mace? Shmamina la'afnuye. We'll say it must be to just keep this phrase open for drasha purposes. Mufna mishnei tzadin, and therefore both said ultimately again it's open on both sides. So it turns out that beged the mace is open both on the mace side as well on the shechva zera side as well as on the sheret side. So the good news is you can make as many drashas as you want because lamaisa the phrase is open, available for drasha on all sides. Hanich laman damar. All right, well, so one more piece. Hanich laman damar. Don minei v'uki ba'asra. Elaman da'amar don minei uminei ma'ika l'meimar. I will say, the Gemara is throwing a lot at us today. So I'll say, so one more piece. In general, when making a kal v'chomer, we'll say, there is a general machlokes about that new law that you come up with. Where does it fit? Is it its own new construct? That's don minei v'uki ba'asra, learn it out and establish it as its new law? Or does it still have to resemble the source law in some dramatic way? So the Gemara says, all of this makes sense if you say don minei v'uki ba'asra. But if you hold don minei uminei, but if you hold that halacha l'maisa again, it's got to resemble the source law. Michael, what is there to say? Amar Rava, Amar Kra, v'chibastem b'gdeichem b'yom hashvi. Pasuk says you shall launder your clothing on day number 7, or right? Kol tmeos shatem in any tuma that you learn out. The mace lo yipsuchim yeshiva. I will say anything that involves tumas mace is always going to have a 7-day tumah. All right, boys, we're going to stop over. So what do we come out with? Okay, what do we come out? We want to say that was a lot of drashos over there. Just understand why we did all of this. Why do we do all of this? Again, let's say we have 3 schools of thought. We have the Rabbanon, who essentially say all the way back. Keren b'rshus hanizak is chayiv chatzi nezek. Chatzi nezek in Rishus Rabim, chatzi Rishus Rabim. Rabbi Tarfon, Keren b'rshus Rabim, chatzi nezek, b'rshus hanizak, nezek sheleima. Where do you learn it out from? Kal v'chomer. But it's a kal v'chomer without dayo. Rabbanon say kal v'chomer does because of dayo. Rabbi Tarfon says, I don't apply dayo. You don't apply dayo. Rabbi Tarfon, dayo is da'oraisa. Rabbi Tarfon says, you're right. When do you apply dayo? Only when it doesn't undermine the kal v'chomer. But if dayo undermines the kal v'chomer, you don't apply it. I will say, this whole exercise we just did for the rest of the Gemara was just trying to show us, and there's a third school of thought. What's the school of thought? So the Rabbanan say, you always apply dayo. Rabbi Tarfon says, you sometimes apply dayo, only when dayo doesn't destroy the kal v'chomer. There's a third school of thought. What's the third school of thought? You don't apply dayo at all. That's all. And this whole thing was trying to find an example of where we don't apply dayo. Let's stop over here for today. Tomorrow, incredible sugya as well. Shkoyach.